Now that we've finished the user's resource, it's time to add a second resource to our application. Since we're going to be making a Twitter-style microblog, we'll add a second resource called microposts. Now, you may recall that we treated sessions as resources. But unlike sessions, microposts will actually be persisted to the database in the same way that users are. Recall from lesson 2 that we already have a sketch of this micropost model, and we already implemented the hasMany and belongs_to methods. In this lesson, we'll fill in the details in that sketch, and we'll also make the forms and partials needed to manipulate and display the results. Before getting started, there are a couple of little things I want to clean up in the application. Let's run the test suite, and while that's running, I'm going to open up the user's controller. Now you may recall that we added this correct user before filter. If you look down here, that pulls the user out of the database with user.find. That let us eliminate the @user assignment in the edit action. We can do the same in the update action. We can actually get rid of this. You can see that our tests still pass. The second thing is a minor tweak to the gravatar_for helper. Recall this is in the user's helper. A Rails tutorial reader noted that the Gravatar website supports secure gravatars. This prevents an error from showing up in some browsers. So all we do here is just change HTTP to HTTPS and add secure dot to the URL. With those commits made, we can push our changes up. And also deploy the application. And we can see that the gravatars are still working. And now we're ready to make a topic branch for user microposts. We'll start by making a model for microposts. In fact, it's identical to the model from lesson 2. As usual, we'll have an ID, which is an integer. Then we'll have the content, which is a string in this case. In general, if you have something like a post in a data model, you'll probably want to use a text field here. But because microposts are short, we can get away with using a string. Then we've got a user ID, which is an integer to identify the owner of the micropost. And then we have the usual created at and updated at columns. As with the user model, we can generate the micropost model at the command line. Take a look at the migration. Let's compare it to the user migration. You can see that the two migrations are identical, apart from the types. Here we've got string string, here we've got string integer, and then the names of the columns. But there is one thing we want to add to the micropost model. As shown in this mockup, we're going to want to list the micropost for a particular user on his profile page. In addition, we're going to want to pull the microposts out of the database in reverse order when they were created, which suggests that we should have an index both on the user ID and on the created at column. There's a way to do both of these at once with what's called a multiple key index. Let's see how to do that. Say add index and the name of the table. And then ordinarily we would put either user ID or created at here. But since we want to be able to select on both, we can actually put them both in an array. Save that and run the migration. Now let's take a look at the micropost spec. You can see it's basically blank. So following in the model of the user spec, we can put a before block here. and put in some lorem ipsum. And then we want to give it a user ID, which means we need a user, so let's put a let in here. Use factory girl. Then we can make the micropost the subject. And then we'll use respond to indicate the columns that the micropost should have. Now there's a subtle problem with this. See if you can figure out what it is. We'll fix the problem in just a moment, but let's run these tests. So we have two failures here because there's no micropost table in the test database. And there we go, now it's passing. Let's start with the validation on the micropost model. We can go over here and say it should be valid. Again, an analogy with the user spec here. And then we certainly want to have a user ID for every micropost. Let's run these. It's failing, but we know how to do this validation. From the user model, we have a presence true validation on the name, say, so let's do the same thing for user ID. There we go. Now, even though this validation works, there's a serious problem with the micropost model, which I alluded to earlier. The problem is that by default, when Rails generates a model, it makes all of the columns accessible. In particular, remember that if something appears on this line, that it can be assigned using mass assignment. So, for example, in the user's controller, in the create action here, we have @user equals user.new params of user. So we'll be doing a similar thing with microposts. The problem is that as currently constituted, anybody could change the user ID of any micropost. So this means we do not want this user ID column to be accessible. Let's write a test for that. We have something similar for admin here. Just copy this. So describe accessible attributes. It should not allow access to user ID. And we're going to expect micropost .new user ID. This should raise the same active model mass assignment security error. So I'm going to rerun these tests, see if you can figure out what's going to happen. Alright, so lots of things failed. So let's scroll up and see what the problem is. You can see we're getting these mass assignment security errors everywhere. And the reason is because we have this here. So we have to get rid of this. But now the problem is that we don't actually have the valid user ID right here. It's not valid because we don't have a valid user ID. So we could do this. This should get it to pass. Good. So we can bypass this @accessible limitation by directly assigning to the attribute. But this is not the standard Rails way to do things. The standard way to do it is to use the association. We set this up in lesson 2. Let's review that. The way we're going to associate microposts with users is by using the belongs to method. That takes the user ID here in the micropost table and associates it with the user with the corresponding ID in the user table. That's going to give rise to this method, micropost.user. Let's add some expectations. should respond to user, and moreover, its user should be this user that it was assigned to. It should actually have a user attribute. Its user should equal user. This uses the its method, which we saw before. Remember, we used it here to test that the user's remember token should not be blank. So let's do that. Got a couple failures, and now we're going to say belongs to user. And while we're doing this, let's set up the association going the other way between users and microposts. A user has many microposts. So given a particular user with here ID 1, we want to associate that user with all of the microposts that have 1 as the user ID. This association will give rise to the user.micropost method. We'll add more detailed tests later, but for now let's just verify that a user object responds to microposts. Alright, now we can clean up this line here. Instead of assigning this user ID directly, we can make use of a method that comes from the association. Here's a table of some of the methods we get with the association. We've already talked about micropost.user, which is the user associated with the micropost, and user.micropost, which is a list of the user's microposts. We also get these association methods. Instead of micropost.create, we can do user.microposts.create. And similarly for create bang and build, which is the analog of micropost.new. So these three methods use the association to infer the correct user ID. And so if you think about it, that lets us do this. User.micropost.build, and then the content. That automatically sets the user ID, so if we get rid of this line and rerun the test, it should be passing. And there we go. Next, we're going to add some refinements to microposts. Recall from the mockup that we want the microposts to come out in reverse order of when they were created. So let's go to the user spec and express that expectation. So what we want is for user.microposts actually to be the microposts of that user, and for them to be in the right order. Let's think about how we're going to do this. Well, first we have to associate some microposts with the subject of this test. Remember, the subject here is @user. So let's make a factory for microposts. We'll give it some content. And then we want to set up the user association. So we want to tell the micropost factory that it expects a user. And the way to do that is just by including a method, user. If that looks a little obscure, let's see how it works. Now remember, the association between microposts and users happens by comparing the user's ID with the user ID column in the micropost table. That means that this user, this subject, has to have a user ID, but right now it's just user.new, which means that it exists in memory. It doesn't have an ID. So that means the first thing we need to do is save it. And then let's create a couple of microposts with that user. And now let's create a couple of microposts with that user's ID. Let's create an older micropost and a newer micropost so that we can test the order. Now because we gave the micropost factory this command here, this user, we can actually set the user just like this. And we can also set the created at column explicitly. This is a really nice effect of using factory girl. The created at and updated at columns are set automatically by active record, but factory girl lets us bypass that. So let's have this one be created 1 day ago. Remember, this is the nice Rails helper, 1.day.ago. And let's have the newer micropost be created 1 hour ago. And then our expectation is that the microposts of the user should be in this order: newer micropost, then older micropost. We've already set up the association, but we don't have the ordering. Let's run this test here. So it's failing as we expect. Now there's actually something a little bit wrong there. We'll see what that is in a second. Alright, the way to set the default order is with what's called a default scope. So active record has a method called default scope, and we can give it an order key. And then we need to give it the column to sort on. In this case, it's the micropost.created@at column. Now on some databases you can actually leave this part off, but I found that that's a little bit brittle, especially when you have more complicated associations. So it's a good idea always to include the name of the table. So what this will do is sort the micropost by created at, but what it will do is return the oldest ones first. So we actually need to reverse the order. Instead of in ascending order, we need them in descending order. So this is the SQL for descending. So this should be passing, but it actually won't pass. We'll see in a moment why. There are actually two problems here. This factory is not registered. That just means I need to save the factory's file and restart Spork. Now let's run this. Should be a different error. There we go. So it's actually working here. We can make this a little bigger. Alright, so we see what the problem is here. We expected the microposts in an array, but we actually just got the empty array. And the reason for that is because this let method creates this variable only on an as-needed basis. So in other words, when we use older micropost or newer micropost, it's only when we actually use the variable that it runs this factory girl line. But in order for @user.micropost to be the actual microposts, we need these microposts to be in the database already. So there's a way to force let to execute the code in its block immediately, and that's with bang. So let bang says run this code right now. Let's save that and rerun it. And there we go. Let's rerun the whole file. And now it's working. By the way, we can now really see that this descending is necessary. Let's see, we'll get a failure here. There's another refinement to add. Let's take a look at the user's controller to think about why. Remember in the last lesson that we gave administrative users the ability to destroy users using the delete links on the user's index page. But now we have a problem, because if we destroy a user, it no longer exists in the database, and all of its microposts will be stranded. The way to do this is to destroy the associated microposts whenever the user is destroyed. So let's write a test for that. I'm going to save the micropost in a local variable. You'll see in a moment why. So now I'm going to destroy the user. And now I want to iterate through the micropost. This is why I saved it. So for each of these microposts, I want to verify that it doesn't exist in the database. The easiest way to do this is to try to find it by ID. So each of these microposts has an ID. We can find by that ID, and if it doesn't exist in the database, this will return nil. Here's the rspec Boolean convention again. This calls .nil question mark on the result of this. Save that and run it. The way to get this to work isn't even one line of code. It's very simple. In the user model, when we have this has many microposts, we can just give it an extra argument that says dependent. So in other words, if the micropost is dependent on this particular user, destroy it. This context dependent means that the user ID of the micropost matches the ID of the user being destroyed. And there we go. As a final step, let's add a couple validations on the content of the micropost. We certainly want the content to be non-blank. And let's enforce the 140 character upper limit. This is just the letter A repeated 141 times, and it should not be valid. We have two failures. We did the same things in lesson 2, but it's been a while, so it's good to review them. So the way we validate the content is presence true, and then a length, which is a maximum. Good. And now we're ready to move on to the code needed to show microposts. Now that we've gotten a handle on the user model, let's write some HTML so that we can actually show some microposts. Let's take a look at the mockup again to see where we're going. Let's write tests to make sure that the content of the micropost appears on the user profile. And also let's test for this count right here. This is going to be in the user pages spec, and we can close these down for now. This will be part of the profile page test, so let's put it in here. Let's put in a block for describing microposts. Let's make 2 microposts and test for their content. Now, in order for the micropost to show up on the page, we're going to have to ensure that the micropost variables exist right away. We just saw how to do that. It's with let bang. Let's just call our microposts M1 and M2 for brevity. And now we can express the expectation that the page should have the content of both M1 and M2. And we'll also check that the count appears. This is a nice example of how to use an association method. You can see here that we can call count on user.microposts, and it will return the total number of microposts. By the way, this count is smart. It actually does perform the count in the database using the association. In particular, it doesn't pull out the whole array of microposts and then count them. All right, let's take a look at the current state of the user profile page. All right, we want to put some microposts right here in the middle. This is the show page. Oh, and actually we should run these tests just to verify that they're failing. There we go. Let's make this a little bigger. All right, in here we're going to put a div, and it's going to have class span8. This spans 8 columns in Bootstrap. Now we shouldn't display anything if there aren't any microposts, so let's handle that. Remember, we have an @user from the user's controller on the show page right here. So if @users.micropost.any question mark, then we're going to show the microposts. Now you may recall this. In the error messages partial, we have this if @users.errors.any, and this is an object that's supplied by ActiveRecord. We see here that microposts, which is an array, also responds to the any method. So if there are any microposts, let's add a header, so an H3 as third level heading. We'll have the heading microposts, and then parenthetically, we'll note the number of microposts. With that, one of our tests should pass. Good. Now we have 3 examples, only 2 failures. And now we want to render the microposts. Now remember that microposts have a specific order. We're going to display the most recent one first. That means this is an ordered list, and the HTML tag for that is OL. And we'll give this a class micropost so that we can style it with CSS. And now we're going to use a trick that we saw in the last lesson. Let's look at the index page. Remember that if we do render @users, because each of these users is a user object, that is to say it has class user, Rails automatically looks for a partial called _user. We're going to use a similar trick here. And then we need to make a micropost partial. Now we need to save it. By default, Rails looks for this partial in a directory under the views directory corresponding to the kind of object. So it looks for the user partial in app views users. That means we need to create a folder here in the views directory for microposts. And put the partial in here. As with the user partial, it's just going to be an li. Now we're going to put a span of class content, and that's where the content's going to go. And then we'll also say how long ago the post was made. We'll give it a timestamp class. Now we want to say how long ago it was posted. And this uses a really cool helper called time ago in words. The argument of time ago in words is the date time, which is what created at and updated at are. So this is going to be micropost. That created at. Now remember, inside this partial, this micropost object gets created automatically. In other words, implicitly, when we see this, Rails says, okay, I know these are microposts. I see that each one of these is a micropost. So I'm going to call a partial called micropost /_micropost. In other words, it's in the micropost directory of the views, and it's in this _micropost partial. And it will automatically create a variable called micropost. So this might seem like magic, but once you get used to the convention, it's really useful. All right, let's save that and see if our tests are passing. And there we go. Since our tests are passing, that means the actual application ought to be working. Let's take a look at that. I'm going to refresh, but we'll be disappointed. Right, there's nothing there. And that's because we don't currently have any microposts associated with our sample users. So let's go into our sample data rake task. Let's just go down here and pull out a small number of users. We could do this for all the users, but this takes quite a bit of time, and we actually don't need this for our sample data. So just a small number of users is fine. Let's pull out the first 6. Now we could do user.all and then like this, but you can actually do this in the database. It doesn't matter for a case this small, but this is nice to know. You can do limit 6. This way it doesn't pull all of the users into memory. And now for each of these users, let's make 50 microposts. So what should the content of this be? Well, it's conventional in this sort of design to use this dummy Latin text, lorem ipsum. We alluded to it briefly before by using it in a couple of our tests. Lorem ipsum has a fascinating history, and I recommend going on the web and searching for it. It's so commonly used that there's actually a tab trigger here in Sublime Text. If you do lorem tab, it puts in some lorem ipsum text. And indeed, the faker gem that we use to make the names also can make lorem ipsum sentences. If you read the faker documentation, you can see that this takes an argument, which is the number of words in the sentence. And then for each of the users, we're going to create the corresponding microposts. So we'll use the createBang method through the association. We use the bang for the same reason we use it up here. It's just so that it makes a complaint, so that it raises an exception if there's a problem. When we're not using the return value, it's sometimes hard to track down bugs if you don't do this. All right, and let's make our sample data here. Oops, there's a problem here. It's probably something we just did. Ah, yeah, so this end here is for the task, and it's complaining that it doesn't know about the user model. And that's because this stuff here needs to be inside here. The way we know about the user model is because of this here, this environment. That's what loads the Rails environment. So there we go. Let's try that. That's good. And now let's make sure we're green. And while that's running, I'm going to restart the server. Remember, we have to do that when we reset the database. Good, we're green, and yes, we want to allow this. Let's go over here and reload this. We'll have to sign in again, although it'll probably just show it to us. Okay, so let's sign in. And there we go. So now we've got the micropost for this example user. Now the first thing you notice is probably that it doesn't look very good. Among other things, we don't really want to number them. It's an ordered list, which gets numbered by default, but we can suppress that with CSS. Now for brevity, I'm just going to paste in the micropost CSS. But you can find this online at the sample app reference application on GitHub, or in the Rails tutorial book, either online or in the PDF. Let's go to our custom CSS file. Let's go to the bottom and paste in the micropost CSS. Save that and refresh, see how it looks. Ah, that looks pretty good. Something else you might notice is that it's pretty long. There are 50 microposts here. And if you look at our mockup, you can see that we intend to paginate them right here. And writing a test for this is left as an exercise. But we can put it in by paginating microposts here in the user's controller. So notice we actually are going to have to change the show page. So right now we're rendering all the microposts. The way we're going to fix this is we're going to say render at microposts. And then in here, we're going to make an at micropost variable. Not here, here. And as with count, we're going to work right through the association at user.microposts.paginate. So this is really cool. Will paginate can work through the association. It works just like this. .paginate, and then we're going to have the same page of params page. Just paste it in. So it's exactly the same basic idea, except it's working through the association. Now you might think, well, if we have these microposts, why do we still need if at user.microposts in these two places? And the answer is that we actually do want this to test whether there are any microposts at all. And here, this is actually a count of the full microposts. We don't want those to refer to just a single page of microposts. But this here is just a single page. So let's go back here. So now it's a shorter list, and we want some links there at the bottom. So inside of this div, let's put in a will paginate. Remember the way we did that here. We did will paginate and then with no arguments. Now the reason we don't have to put an argument here is because we're in the user's controller. Will paginate automatically looks for an @users variable in that case. Over here though, we're still in the user's controller, but in this case we don't want to paginate users, we want to paginate microposts. So the way to do that is like this. Will paginate takes an optional variable, and this should work now. There we go. We have 2 pages of microposts. Oops, and I just noted a minor omission. Here it says posted 8 minutes. We actually want that to say 8 minutes ago. And there's something else wrong here. This stuff here should be inside. Let's shift it over and cut it. There we go. There we go. Good. Now that we can show microposts, let's write the code necessary to create them. We can close things down here. Here's a mock-up of how we're going to handle this. This is actually the home page, which currently looks like this. You can see that it just says welcome to the sample app, but of course for signed in users we actually want this to be something else. In particular, this page is going to have a box where a user can put in a new micropost, as well as a little information about that user. And then we'll eventually have a feed of the microposts of the users being followed by the given user. One thing you might notice about this is that we're not actually going to need views for the micropost pages. Here are the routes that we're going to be using for microposts. We're going to post to /micropost, which will be routed to the create action. And then later in this lesson, we'll learn how to destroy microposts. But notice in particular that we don't have a new page, we don't have show, we don't have any of those things, because those are all going to happen on the user's profile page and on the home page. Let's open up the routes file and put in the routes for these microposts. As with users and sessions, we'll use resources. In this case, microposts, and it's only going to be create and destroy. Let's restart the Spork server. And we'll start with probably the single most important thing, which is the security model for these routes. So let's write some tests for the access control. This is under authorization. So under here, we've got authorization in the user's controller, so let's add another block here for the micropost controller. Now here we're going to be dealing directly with the create and destroy actions, which means that we're going to have to be at the low level like here. We're going to have to use things like put and delete. So we'll use the delete method to submit to the destroy action, and we'll use the post method to submit to the create action. Let's do the latter of those two first. Just a reminder, this is inside of for 9 signed in users. So essentially all we're going to do is require that the user be signed in. So there's a method called post, which sends a post request, and in this case we want to post to the micropost path. That goes to /micropost, and the response should redirect to the sign-in path. Now we'll describe submitting to the destroy action. And here we want to send a delete request. So this goes to the micropost path of some micropost, as in /micropost/1. So we can get that with micropost path of some micropost. So let's just use our factory. And it should do the same thing. It should redirect to the sign-in path. Let's run these tests. Right, they're both failing. Now to get these to pass, we're going to have to create a controller for microposts. We can do that just by creating a new file here and saving it. Controllers. We have micropostcontroller.rb. So here we're just going to create it by hand. There's no need to create it at the command line with a Rails generate. It's very simple. Remember, from the user's controller, this is inheriting from application controller. And there will be two actions, create and destroy. You can see here in the test that the error is actually an uninitialized constant micropost controller. Let's run it again and see if we have a different error. There we go. Now it's saying a missing template. That's right. Because what's happening is it's hitting create and it's trying to render a create template. So what we need is this. We need the signed in user before filter. It's currently located here in the user's controller, but we see now that it's actually more useful than that. Let's cut it here. And then let's put it in the sessions helper because it really is related to signing in. So we put it in the sessions helper, and once we do that, we can put it in here as well. Now I've put in only create and destroy here just to show you that that's what we're doing, but in fact, by default, it protects everything in here. So we actually don't need this line. If we were ever to add another line to this, if we were to add, say, an index action for showing all the microposts, then we would need this line here, this only. But for now, we don't. Let's save everything and rerun the tests. And there we go. Now it's passing. So what's happening is that filter is intercepting both of these requests, this one here, and redirecting to the sign-in path. Now, since we're protecting this destroy action, it's probably a good idea just for consistency to add destroy to this list here. I can go either way on this behavior because if you think about it, you should always be signed in when you hit this destroy action because the delete links would only even show up if you're signed in. But the same thing will happen with these microposts, so just for consistency, let's keep it this way. Let's run the whole test suite just to make sure we're green. Alright, now it's time to get started creating microposts. Let's make a micropost pages spec, an analogy with the user pages spec. It's a bit of a misnomer because they aren't actually pages, but you get the idea. Here we go. Let's change this to micropost pages. All right, let's think about what we want to do here. Let's look at our mockup. So the idea is that we're going to sign in, navigate to the root path, click on post, and if there's not valid information, it shouldn't change the number of microposts in the database, and it should give us an error message. So let's write that in code. The subject here is page. We need a user. And we'll sign in as that user. Okay, let's describe micropost creation. Our first step is to visit the root path. Now, as with the creation of users, we'll handle the invalid and valid information submission separately. So let's do describe with invalid information. We want it not to create a micropost. We're going to use the same trick we did with the user pages spec. Let's look at that here. So it's the same idea. We're going to click the button, and we expect it not to change the user count over here. So in this case, it's going to be the micropost count. If you look at our mockup, we're going to call the button post. So this should not change the micropost count. Let's put in a very simple test for error messages. Let's just look for the word error in the content. Let's run these tests and see how we are. Should be red for sure. Good. Right, now it's time to turn this mockup into an actual page. We're going to create two partials, one for the user information here in the upper left, and then we'll also make a partial for this micropost form. This is going to live on the home page, which is at home.html.erb. Let's open that up. Now if you think about it, all of this stuff here is actually going to be shown only if the user isn't signed in. So let's do that and say else. Can move all this over one. So let's take a look at what that did. Right, so you can see we've gotten rid of all that. So now we need to fill it in with the stuff from the mockup. Let's make a div. We'll give it class row. And we'll make an aside of class span4. And then a section for the user info and another section for the micropost form. We'll put these both in the shared directory. Both of these will need to be accessible inside of multiple controllers, as we'll see. Of course, we have to define these partials. It's going to go in our shared directory. And we'll call it underscore user info. Looking at the mockup, you can see we've got a link to view my profile, and I also want to link this gravatar to the profile. So that means putting both of them inside an A tag, an anchor. So instead of using a link to, we'll just put some embedded Ruby in here. Now in this case, we can't just put current user, we actually need user path because it's not inside of a link to. So Rails can't figure out what the URL is. In fact, it can't even figure out that we want a URL. Let's put the gravatar here. Let's give it a size of 52. Close off the tag. And let's make an h1 for the name. Put in some spans here. And we want the number of microposts as well, as you can see from the mockup here. So here, if we only have one micropost, we want it to say one micropost and not one microposts. So that means using the pluralize method. Remember that from here. In fact, we're about to do some editing on this error messages partial. See if you can figure out why. So we pluralize based on the number of microposts, and the word we're pluralizing is micropost. Now you may wonder why it is that Rails knows how to pluralize micropost, because this isn't even a real word. The answer is that it just adds an S by default. The inflector that underlies this pluralize method actually does know how to pluralize quite a lot of irregular words, but it assumes the word is regular by default. We've got a parenthesis out of place here. Let's take a look at our page. We're missing that other partial. Let's comment that out just for now. So it was complaining because we're missing this partial. You can see that missing partial shared micropost form. Okay, that looks pretty good though. This is a really good start. So now let's make a partial for this guy, this micropost form. So we're going to have a form for a micropost. As you might guess, we'll have to create a micropost variable. So compare this to the one for creating a user. So we have form for at user. Here we have form for at micropost, do, and then a form variable. We'll just put in one div here for the content. And even though this is not a text type, it's actually a string, it looks nicer to have a text area. And the way to do that is with f.textArea. For the content, and we can put in a placeholder. And then we need a submit button. All right, let's see what that looks like. Right, we don't have a micropost. In fact, we can be running our tests here. Still failing. It's a better practice, I think, to run the tests. When you're just getting started, you might try with this browser strategy, but the tests are really a better way to do it, I think. So let's think about where this @micropost variable will be. Well, it has to be on the home page. Remember, this is where things are being rendered. We're rendering the shared micropost form here on the home page. So that controller is the static pages controller. So let's open that up. So this is the home page. So we need a micropost. Think about what we're going to put here, but we only want it if the user signed in. Now, based on the user's controller, you might be tempted to put micropost.new here, but that's a mistake. See if you can figure out why. I'm going to show you in just a second. The answer is that we would have to set the user's ID by hand. So when you have an association, you should essentially never do anything like micropost.new. You should always work through the association, which in this case is going to be user.micropost.build and then optional arguments. So it works just like new. You can leave off the arguments, like here, or you can give it a params hash. In this case, it's a brand new micropost, so we don't have to give it a params hash. But we do want to do user.micropost.build. In this case, the user is the current user. Save that and run our tests again. Still failing. See what the error is. Good, it's actually going through. The problem is it's missing the create template. So let's take a look at the micropost controller. Here it is. I want to keep this user's controller up here. Actually, let's swap them. Here we go. Just close these down. I'm going to leave the error messages there. We're going to use it in just a second. So let's look at this create action. We're going to mimic it here. @micropost equals it's the same thing we just did in the static pages controller. Except in this case, we're going to take in the params. Remember, by doing form for @micropost, we ensure that there actually is something in the params with the key micropost. So now we're just going to do the same thing. We're going to say if at micropost dot save, then we'll handle the save, which is going to be with a flash success. And we should redirect to the root path, just back where we came from. Else, we want to render the home page back. So in this case, we render new. Here we're going to render static pages home. So this will work. You see we need a micropost here, but that's created here. In particular, if there's an error, as we'll see, it will actually preserve the content of this and put it back in the box. All right, let's run our test here. Still failing. Oh, we didn't save it. Okay, only one failure. Good, so the failure we have now is that we don't have the error partial. But this means that it's actually working. In fact, if we go to the browser, it should be working, and here it is. If we post, this should work. Think about where it's going to go. Right, it gives us a flash message, but it went right back to where we were. So eventually, we'll put the feed here, and the user's own micropost will show up in the feed. But for now, we have to navigate over to the profile page to see the micropost. But there it is, hello world. All right, let's handle that error messages partial. Well, how do we handle this in the case of the users? We have this, shared error messages. Let's copy that and paste it in. It's in here. So this is not going to work. Think about why. Let's run our test. All right, it failed. Let's look at the failure. Yes, undefined method errors for nil class. So it's looking in this error messages partial for errors on @user. But there is no @user here. The errors appear on the micropost, which is @micropost. So what we need is an error messages partial that isn't tied to a particular model. In other words, we want this to be an @user if these are user errors, and we want it to be an @micropost if they're micropost errors. And there's a way to do this. We can send a variable to this partial. We give it a key and then a value, which is an object. And then a variable with the name of the key is created in the partial automatically. So let's see how that works. In this case, I'll call it just a generic object. And here it's going to be @micropost. Save that. And so here, wherever we see @user, we should just put an object. Let's rerun our tests. Now we're actually passing. So let's go to the browser. Click on post. You can see the form contains one error. Content can't be blank. Let's try a different error. Let's just get something that's too long. Some lorem ipsum text. Content is too long. So it's working. There's a problem though. Let's run our full test suite. This is why it's so nice to have tests. Like, look at this, it's all broken. See if you can figure out why. Well, we just got rid of the @user here, but there are other places where this error messages partial is invoked. Let's find them all. You can see it's in the edit page and in the new page, but in neither case is there an object. So we need to do this. Over here, the same thing. Now let's go back and see if we're green. Great. All right, we saw that our test suite is passing, and if we go to the browser, we can see that everything's working. And so at this point, our micropost creation is complete. Our next task is to fill in this blank space with a proto feed, which will turn into a real feed in the next lesson, and then we'll implement micropost destruction. To get a handle on what the feed is going to look like, let's take a look at a mock-up. So we see here on the left the stuff that we just created. We've got the user information and the text area for creating new microposts. And then we've got a feed of microposts. In the next lesson, we'll implement the idea of following users, but for now we're just going to make this feed a list of the current user's microposts. We'll start by creating a feed method on users. So let's say it should respond to feed. Alright, so it's empty, but let's think about what this feed should have. Alright, so this is going to be part of the micropost association, so let's put it in here. Micropost association status. So inside of here we have an older micropost and a newer micropost. These both belong to the current user, so they should both be in the feed. So let's say its status feed should. Now let's think about this. The feed is going to be essentially an array. We're actually going to paginate it, but it's going to be a list of users. Now arrays respond to the include method. Let's take a look at that. It include question mark foo is true, quux is false. So inside of the test we can do its feed should include, and then the item that it should include. In this case it should include the older micropost. And should include the newer one as well, because these both belong to that user. And it should not include the micropost of a user who isn't being followed. Now, of course, we don't even have the idea of following yet, but we can still implement this first aspect of the test. Let's put in an unfollowed post using let. The language here is a little imprecise. By unfollowed post, I mean the post of an unfollowed user. Since we don't have following, of course, no posts are followed, but that's okay. So this is going to be the micropost of just some random user. So let's use a factory. This has gotten too long. Let's make it a multi-line block here. So now its feed should not include the unfollowed post. So let's run these tests, just run these guys right here. So they're all failing. Of course, there isn't anything here in the feed. Now I'm going to put in a comment here, just indicating this is not the final implementation. So initially we're just going to include all of the user's microposts. So we can do that like this. Alright, I expected that to pass because I'm stupid. These are not symbols, these are variables. Okay, now let's see if it's going to pass. There it goes. So this is just a list of all the microposts. Self here refers to the user itself, but inside of an object here, unless we're doing an assignment like down here, we can actually omit the self dot. Do this. This should still pass. And as we'll see in the next lesson, there's actually another way of expressing this that generalizes more naturally. So I'm going to use the where method on the micropost model. I'm going to say micropost where the user ID is equal to whatever this current user's ID is. Now, you might be tempted at this point to do something like this. Self.id, that would work. You could also just put an ID. Oops. And this is actually reasonably safe because the ID is just an integer and it's something used internally by Rails. But this is a really dangerous practice. You should never ever interpolate a variable into a string that's being put into a database. And the reason is because of a vulnerability called SQL injection or SQL injection. I encourage you to learn more about SQL injection, but as long as you follow this rule, never interpolate, you'll be fine. Rails will protect you. If there's anything dangerous, it'll be escaped out. So what you do is you put a question mark where you want the variable to be, and then in the argument list, you just add that variable. In this case, ID. All right, now let's write some tests for this mockup. As a first cut, let's just verify that the micropost feed has all of the items in current_user.feed. This will be in the static pages spec. And under home page, let's describe for signed in users. So we should sign in. Let's create a couple of microposts. Sign in and visit the root path. Even though we visit the root path up here, we need to do it again because now we've created some microposts. And we want this to render the user's feed. So let's say user.feed, each item in the feed, and the page should have, let's say, should have an li. Now, in general, the content doesn't have to be unique. So even though we've arranged for it to be unique here, I think it's a good idea to give a unique ID to each of these elements. So let's put in, this is a little tricky. We're going to put in one octothorpe here. This is the capybara syntax for CSS ID. And then we're going to interpolate, using this guy here, the item's ID. So this is just the micropost ID in the database. So this ID is what's going to be put in here. And the text is just the item's content. Let's run these. All right, let's go to the home page. Put in the feed. Save this. Actually, let's run these just to be sure. Just realized it wasn't saved. Okay. So inside of this row, we've got a span 4. We're going to put in a span 8 to div. Of a micropost feed is an H3. And then let's render the feed. That means we need to make the feed partial. It's going to go in shared underscore feed. Now in the feed partial, we're going to assume the existence of an @feedItems variable. We'll have to create that, of course. Now we're just going to defer the feed rendering to a feed item partial. But what we have access to is what will end up being just a list of feed items. In fact, let's go to the static pages controller and see what that's going to look like. This is getting potentially confusing. So in this case, we're going to say if signed in. We're going to create a micropost. Get rid of this now. And we're also going to have feed items. It's going to be the current user's feed paginated based on the page. So we've got this list of feed items. And so on the home page, we're going to render it using shared feed. And here we'll have @feed items, and if there are any, we're going to render a single feed item, which we're about to define. But unlike the other cases where we've rendered a collection, where Rails was able to infer the name based on the controller, here we actually have to tell it that it's a collection of feed items. Let's create a new file. We need a feed item partial now. So there are a lot of moving parts here, but this is the kind of thing that you'll get better at with experience if you're not already good at it. Now we'll give it an ID based on the feed item's actual ID. You can see that we have a variable called feed item. It's because in here, when we render this collection, Rails automatically creates a variable with the same name as the partial. So we have this. This is to satisfy this this test in here. Right here. So let's take another quick look at the mockup. So here, instead of just including the content and how long ago it was posted, let's also put in a link to the user and the user's avatar in anticipation of the full feed in the next lesson. Now in the past we've done something like this, gravatar for the user. In this case, remember feed item is a micropost, so we can get feed item.user. But this is ambiguous when we omit parentheses for multiple methods, so it's a good idea to do this. We want it to link to the user, so that's also this. Let's put a link to the user's name. I'm doing escape completion here a lot. I just hit escape to complete the word. That's why it's so fast. Also these tab triggers. All right, let's save everything and run our tests. Undefined method paginated, so there's just a typo here. Paginate. And I'm getting what I deserve here. You should always close this off right away. That's what happens when you don't. Now it's complaining that visiting the root path is calling ID for nil, so that's this here. It's actually in the feed item. So that's this. It means that the feed item is nil somewhere. And this is the kind of thing that's really annoying, because this ought to work, this render, and I'm not sure why it doesn't, but when you have this collection parameter, you need to tell it explicitly that this is a partial. And while we're at it, let's put in a will paginate. Again, writing a test for this is left as an exercise. Remember, we're paginating these items, so we can just give it @feed items. Now this might pass. There we go. So there's one more detail that's annoying, but let's run this this test suite here. So that's working. Let's go back here though and see what happens if we post. Yeah, so if you submit an invalid post, we have this problem that @feed items is nil when you post to the micropost create action. in here. So what's happening here is in this branch when it's not working, when the save fails, it needs an @feedItems variable. This is another case where the test suite is really valuable. I happen to know that would happen, but if we run the test suite, we'll see that it should catch that. If it doesn't, we should definitely write a test for it. But yeah, you can see that it's failing. The way to fix this is to put an @feedItems variable here. Now, of course, we could just do this. If you paste it in and reload it, this actually works. Now, I don't think this used to work. And it's kind of weird because if you go down here to the pagination links and look at the URL, it's /micropost/create. And that really should not be responding to a GET request. And I'm not sure why it is, actually. So this kind of behavior makes me really nervous. This is the sort of thing that could easily be considered a bug and might be changed in a different version of Rails. So I think in the case of making an error, it's probably better just to render back something that will always be right. Let's just have an empty array. This way there are no links. I admit it's kind of weird to have it be empty. So if you want to take your chances with /micropost/create always responding properly to a GET request, you can go ahead and do that. But for now, I'm just going to leave it like this. Let's just see our test suite pass. Good. All right, our final step is to allow users to delete their own microposts. Let's take a look at a mockup. Here we've got some microposts and a delete link. Now these microposts appear in two places. They appear both on the feed and on the user's own homepage. So here, I said homepage, I meant the profile page. So the homepage and the profile page both have these microposts. And our plan is to put delete links here for the user to be able to delete his own microposts. Now we should only show the delete link if the current user is the owner of the micropost. So let's express that expectation. As a counterpart to micropost creation, we'll have micropost destruction. We'll need a micropost to destroy. And if we are signed in as the correct user, which we are up here, then we should see a delete link. And if we click it, it should change the number of microposts in the database by -1. All right, let's implement that by putting a delete link in the micropost partial. The current user is the micropost user. Then let's link to deleting the micropost. We have to give it method delete, an optional confirmation, and then we actually need to give it what's called a title. I believe this is part of the HTML standard. You can actually probably leave this out, but I'm going to put it in for completeness. And then we need something really similar for the feed item. There's some duplication here, so as an exercise, you can try to eliminate it. It's very similar here. We're going to have feed item.user. And instead of micropost, it'll be feed item. take a look at the micropost. There we go. We've got a delete link, and here, oh, undefined local variable. Oh, this is the wrong partial. This is the feed partial. We want it in the feed item. Here it is. Oh, and I forgot the closing li there, didn't I? Look at that. Let's fix that up. Good. So we've got the delete link. Let's get it to work. Well, we can run our tests. Alright, it's failing because if you look in the micropost controller, we don't do anything here yet in destroy. So let's put in a filter to make sure that we have the correct user. Let's make a variable for the micropost. And we're always through the association. I'm going to find by ID, params of ID. So the reason we do find by ID here is because we're about to test if this is nil. Now, if this were just a find, it would raise an exception if it didn't find it. But we don't want it to raise an exception, we want it to be nil. So I'm going to redirect to the root path if the micropost is nil. Let's run our tests. Still failing. Oh, right, we don't have anything to destroy. This is easy, though. We have an app micropost. So let's destroy it. Let's just redirect to the root path. And now we're passing. Let's run the whole test suite. Let's check it out in the browser. And there we go. It's working. All right, so with this, we've got working microposts on our site. So now it's time to implement the idea of following users. Let's clean up here. Great. We'll defer deploying to Heroku until the next lesson when our application will be complete. This is a short addendum. I'd just like to note that there were some missing tests here that got lost when I did a previous addendum. These delete links had gotten lost, so let's run them. Put them over here. So you can see it's failing, and the reason is because we're missing our admin. So that's actually a little bit of a continuity error. You might have noticed that. So let's add it back in. This is a method, not a symbol. Need to restart Spork. Run our tests again, see if we're green. That's strange. Oh, it's looking like the delete actually got lost. So let's put it back in. You might have noticed this too. Let's put it in, rerun our tests. I'm also missing one test in the user spec. Let's put it in. It's the test for a user being an admin if we toggle the admin attribute. Let's run the full test suite. There we go. All right, and now we're good to go.